Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where every week I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar each comes up with a topic from history that usually the other person doesn't know about, but always the other person doesn't know what we're going to pick. So this topic that I have now, you've probably heard about it, but you probably don't know everything. So I'm going to ask anyways, what do you know about the Amazons?
Oh, the tribe of female warriors.
Yes.
Very little, actually. Okay, yeah.
What are the stereotypes that you have about them?
Oh, that they have spears, and I guess they're scantily clad, and they ride horses without saddles. I don't know if this is this might be from like 80s movies, and then I guess there's no men around.
Yeah, you probably, back when we were kids, there was that Hercules series with Kevin Sorbo, and then there was also Xena Warrior Princess with Lucy
Oh yeah,
Lawless.
that may
Yeah,
be,
and
yeah.
they depicted the Amazons in there.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, they don't really know. Like, they either use the term Amazon to refer to somebody that they think is like a tough woman, or they just think it's like a Greek myth, which never really existed. So what I want to do is there is a Greek myth, but it is actually based on something. So to begin with, what I want to do is, well, let me start with like something a little more modern. Remember where I was showing you like the state seals for some of the different states when we were talking?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of like in the United States, there's a lot of in the old days, a lot of borrowing from Roman and Greek ideas in terms of architecture, also the use of Latin. And you'll see Latin inscriptions on some of the seals and the money. And you'll see images of sometimes women wearing helmets and carrying spears. And in some of the state seals, there'll be these women wearing a very particular type of hat, which covers over the ears. And there was an actual people group that wore those things. So what I want to do is actually I want to start by reading some of Sir John Mandeville, which, if you recall, I used when we were talking about Prester John. So
Mm-hmm.
he actually said something. Said something about the Amazons. So what he says is, then one reaches the land of Amazonia, in which there are no men, only women. People say they will not allow any man either to live amongst them or to have dominion over them. This is because there was once a king in the land, and men lived there and had wives as they did in other countries. And it happened that the king, who was called Scelopatus, went to war with the Scythians. He was slain in battle, and all his country's noblemen of good blood died with him. When the queen and the other ladies of the land heard that the king and the noblemen had been killed, they gathered together and armed themselves, and they killed all the men left in their country. Since that time, no man has lived amongst them. When they want a man to wait, hold on. Okay, when they want a man to sleep with, when they want a man to sleep with them, they send for him from a nearby country, and the men stay for up to 8 days or as long as the women want, and then go away again. If they have little boys, they send them to their fathers when they have been weaned. If they have little girls, they look after them properly. If they come from aristocratic stock, they cauterize the left breast so they can carry a shield. If they are of normal stock, they cauterize the right breast so they can shoot a bow and arrow. The women there are terrific warriors and are often mercenaries for other rulers. The queen rules the country as well. Okay, and also, as a brief aside, I'd also mention that the letter from Prester John, which started all the Prester John myths, they
Mm-hmm.
also, according to that lore, there's a tribe of Amazons that lives in India and pays tribute to Prester John. So
Can I ask a question?
go for it.
What does it mean to cauterize the breast? What is it? What
Or
is
Nick.
that? To burn it off. Whoa.
Yeah, to seal like like when you get open wound in battle, they call it cauterizing because they burn it and it kills the germs and also seals up the skin.
Okay. All right. That's what I thought. I just want to make sure. That sounds painful. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, that's one of the stereotypes. When I was in middle school, they used to say that they would cut off one boob, so that they could shoot better. And I was like, okay, well, at that time, I thought it was all just made up, kind of like centaurs and satyrs and such. And I was like, well, why would that make them shoot better? I don't understand. And there's actually a place where that myth comes from, which let's see what I have. I'm going to get to. So according to the Greek legends, Amazons come from a place called Themyscira, which is near the Term River in the Black Sea region of Anatolia, between the modern cities of Sinop and Ordu, which I guess are Turkish names. So, of course, the Turks, they're not the original people from that part of the world. They would come later. Near the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. And supposedly they would live apart from men and met with them only to reproduce. And if they, had a girl, they would keep the girl. If they had a boy, they would just keep him until he was weaned and then turn him over to the father. And at one point, they go to war with Athens. And this is in the ancient times, because Theseus kidnaps somebody named Antiope, who's the sister of the queen of the Amazons at the time. And the Amazons launch a raid, and they take her back. And on their way back, they found the city of Ephesus. And the Amazons are mentioned by Homer in the 8th century BC, who refers to them as Antianere. I'm going to put this word spelled out in the slideshow because I don't know if I'm saying. Okay, but this word Antianere means either antagonistic to men or equal to men. So it's translated two different ways, depending on who's doing the translation. Okay, and then here, let me go ahead. I've got something else I want to read. And this comes from the Histories written by Herodotus. Okay. All right. So this is written by Herodotus, and Herodotus, he wrote down the Histories in 425 BC. Okay, and he's considered to be the first historian, Herodotus. Okay, so here's what Herodotus says about the Saurometae. Oh, wait, hold on. It's light here. Okay. About the Saurometae, the following tale is told. And by the way, Saurometae, that's an older word for Sarmatians. So that's what you can think about as I read this. So about the Saurometae, the following tale is told. When the Hellenes had fought with the Amazons. Now, the Amazons are called by the Scythians Oiorpata, which means in the Hellenic tongue, slayers of men. For man, they call Oior, and Pata means to slay. Then, as the story goes, the Hellenes, having conquered them in the battle at the Thermodon, were sailing away and conveying with them in 3 ships as many Amazons as they were able to take prisoners. These in the open sea set upon the men and cast them out of the ships. But they knew nothing about ships, nor how to use rudders or sails or oars. And after they had cast out the men, they were driven about by wave and wind, and came to that part of the Maeotian lake where Crimnoi stands. Now Crimnoi is in the land of the free Scythians. There the Amazons disembarked from their ships and made their way into the country. And having met first with a troop of horses feeding, they seized them, and mounted upon these, they plundered the property of the Scythians. The Scythians, meanwhile, were not able to understand the matter, for they did not know either the speech or they did not know either their speech or their dress or the race to which they belonged, but were in wonder as to whence they had come, and thought that they were men of an age corresponding to their appearance. And finally, they fought a battle against them, and after the battle, the Scythians got possession of the bodies of the dead, and thus they discovered that they were women. They took counsel, therefore, and resolved by no means to go on trying to kill them, but to send against them the youngest men from among themselves, making conjecture of the number, so as to send just as many men as there were women. These were told to encamp near them, and do whatsoever they should do. If, however, the women should come after them, they were not to fight, but to retire before them. And when the women stopped, they were to approach near and encamp. This plan was adopted by the Scythians because they desired to have children born from them. The young men accordingly were sent out and did that which had been commanded them. And when the Amazons perceived that they had not come to do them any harm, they let them alone, and the two camps approached nearer to one another every day. And the young men, like the Amazons, had nothing except their arms and their horses, and got their living as the Amazons did, by hunting and by taking booty. Now the Amazons at midday used to scatter abroad, either one by one or two by two together, dispersing to a distance from one another to ease themselves. And the Scythians also, having perceived this, did the same thing. And one of the Scythians came near to one of those Amazons who were apart by themselves, and she did not repulse him, but allowed him to lie with her. And she could not speak to him, for they did not understand one another's speech, but she made signs to him with her hand to come on the following day to the same place, and to bring another man with him, signifying to him that there should be two of them, and that she would bring another with her. The young man, therefore, when he returned, reported this to the others, and on the next day he came himself to the place, and also brought another. And he found the Amazon awaiting him with another in her company. Then, hearing this, the rest of the young men also, in their turn, tamed for themselves the remainder of the Amazons. And after this, they joined their camps and lived together, each man having for his wife her with whom he had had dealings at first. And the men were not able to learn the speech of the women, but the women came to comprehend that of the men. So when they understood one another, the men spoke to the Amazons as follows: We have parents, and we have possessions. Now therefore, let us no longer lead a life of this kind, but let us go away to the main body of our people and dwell with them, and we will have you for wives and no others. They, however, spoke thus in reply: We should not be able to live with your women, for we and they have not the same customs. We shoot with bows and hurl javelins and ride horses, but the works of women we never learnt, whereas your women do none of these things which we said, but stay in the wagons and work at the works of women, neither going out to the chase nor any whither else. We therefore should not be able to live in agreement with them. But if ye desire to keep us for your wives, and not to be thought honest, if ye desire to keep us for your wives, and to be thought honest men, go to your parents, and obtain from them your share of the goods, and then let us go and dwell by ourselves. The young men agreed and did this. When they had obtained the share of the goods which belonged to them, and had returned back to the Amazons, the women spoke to them as follows: We are possessed by fear and trembling to think that we must dwell in this place, having not only separated you from your fathers, but also done great damage to your land. Since then ye think it right to have us as your wives, do this together with us. Come, and let us remove from this land, and pass over the river to Nice, and there dwell. The young men agreed to this also, and they turned over to Nice, and made their way toward the rising sun. for 3 days' journey from Tanais, and also toward the north wind for 3 days' journey from the Maeotian lake. And having arrived at the place where they are now settled, they took up their abode there, and from thenceforward the women of the Saromatai practiced their ancient way of living, going out regularly on horseback to the chase, both in company with the men and apart from them, and going regularly to war, and wearing the same dress as the men. And the Saromatai make use of the Scythian tongue, speaking it barbarously, however, from the first, since the Amazons did not learn it thoroughly well. As regards marriages, their rule is this, that no maiden is married until she has slain a man of her enemies, and some of them even grow old and die before they are married because they are not able to fulfill the requirement of the law. So, kind of interesting. And I believe that the sea, the Maeotian Sea, is a reference to the Black Sea. And so the term, what I found out at Herodotus, that's 425 BC, that this was written down. And, Herodotus, I believe that the reason they call him the first historian is because he just tries to give the facts without giving an opinion, and he doesn't get into mysticism. Although I haven't read all of the histories, so maybe he has, but I don't think so. I haven't seen it yet. And so the term Amazon is actually not a Greek word. It's a foreign word, most likely from an Iranic language, a language related to Farsi that sprung from the same source. So the idea that they removed one breast was actually the result of the Greeks trying to force a Greek meaning onto the name, the word. So Maison supposedly sounds somewhat like the Greek word for breast, and
Okay.
A has to do with removal. And actually, there's been a lot of depictions of Amazons in Greek art, and they're always shown as being whole, and also in Roman art. Even though this oral tradition was put in about them missing one of their body parts. So after having read all this, do you think so there is an actual people group that this corresponds to, and I spent a lot of time looking up images of Amazons in Greek art. In Roman art, the depictions of Amazons are heavily romanticized. So in Roman art, they'll show them, with like one boob hanging out a lot of the time, and they don't wear any hat or helmet or armor, and they only have like a kind of a short, flowy tunic as their only bit of clothes, and they're usually depicted with arrows. And this is actually a distortion from the original Greek art. You could say an example of the telephone game. So if you look at the Greek art, the depictions of Amazons, there is an actual people group that it corresponds to, and they're called Scythians. And the Scythians were an Indo-European culture related to Iranians, and of course also to us, albeit somewhat more distantly. And they would usually have, a lot of them had red hair, quite common, and blonde hair. And before there were all these Turkic cultures like we have today, the Russian steppes and Central Asia were full of Indo-European peoples. And in fact, in the ancient world, there was a contiguous Indo-European realm stretching all the way all the way down to Persia, and then as far east as the Vedic culture in India, where they were mixing with, the native population there, and then also as far east as China. There in east today, what's Western China, there used to be these people called the Tocharians that had red hair and blonde hair, and they've still found bodies and mummies of these people. Don't look anything like Chinese people, but they used to be there as well. So before the Huns invaded, it was all Europe quite literally stretched all the way to China and India. And a lot of these people were nomadic, like the Scythians. They lived kind of similar to Mongols. They would pitch tents and move around and ride horses. And they're depicted in Greek art on the vases. And they've found the burial mounds of the Scythians where there's a lot of gold and other artifacts. Not as much as there were originally because the stuff has been looted over thousands of years. But if you compare the Greek art and the Scythian art, you can see the same kind of people wearing the same kind of clothes and, riding horses and carrying the same type of gear. And from what I've seen, about 37% of Scythian graves contain skeletons of female warriors. Okay. And as for the gear that they had, they would be buried with their weapons. And you find women, let's see, they'd have arrows, bow and arrow, swords, daggers, spears, shields, slings, and armor as well. Although in the Greek art, the Amazons are usually not depicted as wearing armor. But if you look at the Greek art, then you can see the female Scythian warriors, which they referred to as Amazons, they dressed exactly the same as men, but they would depict, and you can see the patterns of the clothes and everything. So there'd be like a shirt or an overcoat and a belt, and then underneath that kind of long pants and boots and a long sleeve shirt. And then they would have a hat on their head, which comes down and covers the ears. And sometimes you can see hair going out of it, sometimes not. But you'll still see this hat, like in a lot of our heraldry here in the United States, which is like evocative of the Amazons. You see like these women wearing these hats. And that's what the Scythians, the archers, used to wear. And from what I've seen, most of the Scythian warriors would not wear any kind of armor at all, but they might have a shield, and that would usually be it. They had some heavier units that would wear what I believe was like lamellar armor, kind of like the Mongols would wear, where you had a bunch of squares, like a chest plate with a bunch of squares, and then pants that are kind of like armored chaps of lamellar armor, which I'm not sure if they went all the way around. I should have looked that up. I'm thinking not, but I'll mention it, when I render this. So and there's one more thing, like in the Greek art, the Scythian, the Amazon women that they would say were Amazons, depictions of Amazons, they'd be dressed just like the men, but they would depict the overcoat. They would try to feminize it somewhat and make it look kind of flowy and loose, like what the Greek women would wear, like as their tops kind of over their dress, except it still has like Scythian patterns, and they don't have dresses on underneath. They have pants. So there's names in the Greek letters attached to some of these depictions of Amazons. And it turns out that for a while, people didn't know what it was. They thought it was nonsense words because it's written in Greek, but it's not any Greek name or word. Turns out these are names in the Scythian language. And I found some of the names with translations. I'm going to try to say them. So there was, yeah, so get ready. There was, and anybody listening to this is going to laugh, Pukpupis, which means worthy of armor. And like I said, a lot of them, they're not, in the Greek art, they're not depicted as wearing armor, or I haven't seen any yet. And then Kepes, which means hot flanks. Barkida means princess, and Casa, one who heads a council. So a lot of the Scythians, it looks like they were more concerned about the cold than they were about getting shot or stabbed. And, and I could be wrong on this, but from what I've seen thus far, based on what they found in the graves, about 1/3 of the female population participated in the fighting. And some of them had wounds they recovered from, including head wounds. So they mostly, what the women would do is they would fight on horseback, and also the men. And it looks like the Scythians did not give armor to their archers, who were kind of a light cavalry unit. It was mostly mounted.
Hmm.
And then you had some men, which I guess were heavier units, that would be wearing the armor, including helmets.
Yeah, I think Persian archers didn't have armor either. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
Achaemenid Persians, they had mostly just clothing, as well. And of
Yeah.
course, Scythians are related to Persians closely, or they were, and like the Massagetae, who supposedly killed, I think it was Cyrus, the Massagetae. They had a queen named Tomiris. They were also Scythians, closely related. Um, but yeah, so coming to this whole idea of Amazons, some of the articles and stuff that I was reading, they tried to retroactively put their 21st century politics back onto the situation and talk about like men and women being at war and all this kind of nonsense. And they also said that one of the people I read, they tried to say, oh, the Greeks, they were merciless towards the Amazon women because they were afraid of women having power. But you have to understand, the Greeks were a sedentary culture. They lived in fortified cities, and they relied heavily on infantry forces, to defend their cities, where all the men had, they had long weapons, and they had armor, helmets, sword, shield, and they marched in close formations.
Spears. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. Um, and and I heard a story about actually the Afghanistan war. It was written by a female veteran, and over in that part of the world today, under some of the situations that become tense, women have been kind of forced to participate in the fighting. And what they said is, with this one woman that was talking about it, what she said is, for a long time she had no issue. She was carrying all the gear that the men carried, but her body wore out faster than theirs did. And now she has permanent problems because they would carry like over 100 pounds of gear. And like it or not, the female body is less durable than the male body, has less natural strength. Now, if you're a lazy guy who sits around and does nothing, and then you have and there's a lazy woman that sits around and does nothing, usually the man is still going to be significantly stronger. But if that woman works out and reaches her peak strength, then yes, she can be stronger than the lazy man. But if they're both at peak strength, then again there's a disparity. So the Greeks, they relied on armor and marching by foot, but the Scythians were a nomadic culture, not always, but quite often they were, and they would ride on horses. So what do you need? You need to carry everything with you in the saddle, right? Including all these weapons. So in that kind of situation, it makes sense for the women to fight because there's like the saying they said in Lord of the Rings that those who don't know how to use swords can still die on them, and then there's another saying like a gun in the hand is better than a cop on the phone. So if you're like living in the steppes, you have no city and no walls, then there's more of a need for the women to be able to defend themselves when something happens. And since a lot of the combat is on horse, then the woman doesn't have to carry around hundreds of pounds of gear. The horse does, right? So it's a quick and easy way to kind of swell your numbers when you're dealing with other tribes, is to have the women also participate in some of the violence.
Yeah, I imagine it's also a cultural thing, and that's probably why it spoke to the imagination of the Greeks, because in the Greek society, the women had very traditional roles, quote unquote, like they were usually much younger than the men when they got married, and they were like pretty much expected to stay in the house and really not go outside and do anything else. So then, for example, if you went to look at the Vikings, for example, you had I guess it's also a wilder place, but then the women had also way more authority and freedom, and they had a stronger position within those societies. And you also had the shield maidens, for example, there. So that, I imagine that's also why the Greeks were, talking about these Amazons, because it would be so completely different to what they were used to. But it's definitely not uncommon for women to fight. I think there was also a grave they found recently in Denmark, 10th century. And now they think that there was a female warrior, and they thought it was a Viking one, and probably she was Slavic because of, I think, the type of axe they found. So it's, it makes sense. And but yeah, of course, also the Greeks, they would use mostly heavy armor, and I think it was mostly spears. And aren't they called hoplites or?
Hoplites, yeah, the hoplites were those formations, like the long phalanxes.
Yeah,
phalanxes.
And then if you look at the Persians, I think the Persians had way more archers than the Greeks did, for example.
They also had mounted units too.
Yeah, so it makes a lot more sense than that you'll have women in those battles as well. Yeah.
Achaemenid Persians, the foot soldiers had very little armor at all. They would wear hats like kind of wrapped around their faces. At most, they might have like a chest piece of some kind of scale armor. I think it was scale armor, which could either be leather or bronze. But the only units that were really heavily armored were usually like a heavy horse cavalry unit, and then they had archers with no protection. So yeah, I mean, Persians are closely related with, or they were closely related with the Scythians.
And there was really a numbers game for the Persians. They would like outnumber their opponents like 10-1 sometimes, and they had so many archers, way more archers than other armies as well. That was like the backbone of their military. And that they said that when they would fire, that the Persian army would fire, the arrows would actually block out the sun.
Yeah, that's like how the Battle of Thermopylae.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense then to also use your women in, because then you'll have bigger numbers. Although I don't know if the Persians use women as well. But
I don't. Yeah. I think for the Persians, they had like some noble women that would kind of join the armies and serve as officers, but they didn't have like regular foot soldiers and such, like the Scythians did. But the Scythians were more barbaric and mobile, whereas the simpler the society, well, I don't want to say a wrong generalization, but the division of labor was different because of the circumstances. Like the Persians had walled cities and they were sedentary. The Scythians were not. So, maybe you have to be ready for the next tribe to come over and attack you. Probably a lot of them slept with their weapons nearby. And maybe the men are engaged with fighting a battle, and the women have to go and hunt some animals, or vice versa, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the same with the Vikings, right? They would go out raiding, and then who would be left home? And your neighboring tribe might attack you while you're out. So you'd have to be ready to fight as well.
Also, I think that the political system makes a difference, because in the ancient Greek city-states, they had democracy. Of course, democracy was just reserved for the men. But other cultures like the Persians and the Scythians, they were more monarchical, like hereditary leaders. So you might have a situation where the king dies, and then his wife is going to take over. Or maybe the king doesn't have a son, and he dies and only has a daughter. Well, the daughter is going to take over. That's probably how Tomyris got into power. So that's a difference. Whereas the Greeks, they would regularly choose their leaders, and they saw it as like the domain of men. They had much more regimented society. But people that are moving around all the time with no place to permanently call home, you're going to have to you're going to have to split up these tasks. There's not as much room for social stratification.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's cool. You should include some cool pictures. So,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I've got a ton of pictures, and my theory is that now there's one thing that I didn't quite resolve. Well, first let me give my theory, and then I'll give this. So my theory is that when the Greeks started to encounter these Scythians, these barbarians, they would have come into contact with female warriors as well, because these guys, I mean, not all the women, but a significant number of them would fight. And the Greeks, I could see them concluding that, oh, there's women here fighting with these Scythians. Oh, it must be an alliance of tribes, and there must be a tribe of women out there somewhere. It makes sense based on that worldview, because they would let their women go out and fight, even though they did have some women that were physically fit and would play in like the female Olympics, And there's also lots of good reasons why you don't want your women to fight, which is the main reason, that women have not been, aside from difference in strength, like women have a limited period in which they can reproduce, and they can only have like they can only be pregnant like once at a time, right? So, but like a man, he can go and he can repopulate his whole town in just a few nights. So if you lose your women, it's much more devastating to the next generation than if you lose your men. But with the Scythians,
if you have 3 like people and 2 of them are men and 1 woman.
Yeah,
yeah, and the other way around, if you have 2 women and 1 man. Yeah,
but with the Scythians, it's a different situation, because they don't live in walled cities and they're living off the land. So they're using horses more and archers. So you've got to do something. And like, even if all the men decide to leave and all the women are still sitting there with the tents, well, if another tribe comes, then a sword in the hand is more useful than a husband in the battlefield somewhere else. So
yeah, and I think it's cool actually, the women fighting. I mean, it makes sense, and their independence as well, and especially like for like things with archery and stuff, it makes no difference really. Especially because they were shooting from long distances anyway. It's like volleys of arrows. It's not like anyway.
Probably also turning around in the saddles and shooting at you while they're running away too.
Yeah, so it's it makes sense, right? And I can definitely see how women could do that just as well as men. I imagine like if you're doing like a shield wall or something and you're physically pushing shield to shield, and when it comes to that's usually like pure strength, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. But for other things, it does make sense.
Yeah. So. And and of course, like the Scythians, they also took arrows as well. They would use shields, kind of like the Persians, And I think a lot of these people, I've seen quite a few things where you have infantry with no armor at all in the ancient world except for a shield. And my guess is they're just like, hide behind the shield when the arrows come, and then saving money on not making armor for them, but instead just making a shield. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool story.
One thing that does mystify me about this is like the story from Herodotus, where he says the Amazon women didn't speak the Scythian language. Because when the Amazons appear in the oldest Greek art, they are Scythians, like wearing Scythian gear and having Scythian names. But then there was some other Scythians that were kind of sedentary and more civilized. But even so, if there's diversions in the language, then it shouldn't be impossible for like the men to learn the women's language, right?
Yeah, that makes no sense. Yeah.
So that made me wonder if in that particular story, I mean, at that point he's reporting like, I guess, an oral tradition that he heard from the Sarmatians. So it may not be completely accurate, even though he accurately wrote it down. But I'm
No,
also
that's why he tried to. That's why they call him the father of histories, because he tried to get to the, to the real story. But then again, like a lot of his stories are about things that took like centuries before he was alive. So then he would just have to use other sources and try to get to the truth. But it doesn't mean it is the truth what he wrote down.
yes,
Yeah.
and there
So
were some other people groups living in that region between the in the Caucasus area, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They weren't all Scythians. There were some other groups there that were Indo-European, who spoke different languages. Like one of them was the Mycop culture. So I'm wondering if that example there, assuming it happened exactly like he said it, maybe it was some other group of people that the Greeks had a war with, and then captured the women, and then of course the women turned out to be too brutal for the like, I don't know. Somebody probably decided to let loose, like, oh, just loosen my chains a little bit, and then there it goes. But um,
that's
what?
basically how any cheesy movie,
Yeah,
how the plot goes.
yeah. But then they didn't know how to navigate the ship because they were horses, right?
Yeah, that
Greeks.
sounds. I wouldn't know how to navigate a ship, but I
Yeah.
can just imagine the movie scenes like, oh, if you would just untie these bands, we could get comfortable together.
Yeah.
you know, and as he karate kicks them in the face.
It's like the
yeah,
new guy that does it, and
yeah, yeah.
but
yeah.
yeah, that's the only thing I wonder about. I mean, so but like I know for sure that the depictions of Amazons are depicting Scythians, but for that particular story, I'm thinking, okay, how come they wouldn't have known the same language? I mean, there were some other groups from that side of the Black Sea, so it could be that the women were from like another group and another Indo-European culture, because
Yeah,
that
and
was too early for there to be any Mongoloid people there. It's too early for that.
yeah, then they were the slaves, and yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah. They thought
yeah,
they were going to take them as war booty, but then some idiot decided to loosen their chains.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, my wrist hurts.
oh, let me. I'd be really grateful if you just
yeah,
like really grateful. Uh, yeah, and then
yeah.
he just takes his keys and unlocks everyone else, and then crap, women got
I think
loose.
I've seen that movie.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, man. Nah, cool story.
yeah.
I didn't know much about them at all. I feel like I know a whole lot more. Yeah,
Yeah, so that's all I've got. I will, because of that one thing that I haven't quite resolved, I'm going to do some more research into those other cultures that are there. One of our watchers, he said something about the Mycop culture, and I looked into them a little bit. So I think I think it's worth looking into. There was another culture that used to be there in that area called Yamnaya culture. Um, but thinking about like how big the Indo-European realm used to be in the Bronze Age, it is like something that the Bible said, right? It also in Genesis, like Noah, he says that I will greatly enlarge the territory of Japheth. So, and it looks like it happened fairly soon, at the dawn of history. There was a huge realm, like bigger than Russia, and then the Huns are the main. That's like the beginning of the end for the Scythians and Sarmatians and other steppe peoples. They get pushed west and south by the Huns and other Turkic groups coming out of Mongolia. Which that might also be a good topic for us to talk about as well. Like the Turks, they have this legend called the Epic of Ergenekon, and it's actually similar to the Mongol legend about the ancestor of their people being the product of a wolf mating with like a doe, a deer.
mm.
And the Chinese people surrounded them in the ancient times and had them all pinned into this valley and wouldn't let any of them out. And then they just multiplied and multiplied. And then they overwhelmed the Chinese people and burst out onto the steppes. And then I guess that's when they started killing off or driving away the Scythians. But anyways, I think that's enough. I think this has gotten long enough. So
yeah. The
like,
gray wolves. Yeah. Anyway.
yeah, that's where that. Well, yeah, that's where that comes from. That's their ancestor, a wolf.
Yeah.
But we also have something like that in our legend with. Oh no, I was going to say Romulus and Remus, but the wolf wasn't actually their mother. She just nursed them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, man. Good story.
Well, thank you. Leave us a comment, like, share if you really like our content. Share it. And at this stage, we're taking suggestions. We've taken every suggestion so far. So if you leave us a suggestion or a request, then there's a very good chance we'll take it, but it'll probably take a few weeks to show up.
Yep. So, yeah, man. So like, share, subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe so you get we do these every week. And thank you for being a listener and hope you enjoyed it. And see you in the next one.